22 November 1942, 1847. 6th Army Headquarters, a timber and earth bunker near Golubinskyaya, west of Stalingrad. Colonel General Friedrich Paulus, 52 years old, sat hunched over a map table under a single shaded lamp. The bunker smelled of damp soil, cigarette smoke, and engine oil tracked in on boots. A field telephone rang and rang again, then went silent. A second line, an armored cable run back toward the dawn, crackled with static. Outside, the temperature was already below freezing. The wind carried the distant thump of artillery, low, steady, like doors slamming in a long corridor. Paulus did not need a report to know what it meant. The Soviet pincers had almost met. At 1852, Major Wilhelm Adam, Paulus's adjutant, pushed through the low doorway with a folded signal form in his gloved hand. The paper was stamped with the code office mark from Army Group Command. Adam's face was tight. He did not speak until he was at the map table. He placed the message down. Paulus read it once, then again, slower. It was not an operational suggestion. It was an instruction from the top of the Reich, short, absolute, and in the language of command that did not permit negotiation. Stand fast. No withdrawal without authorization. Hold Stalingrad. The order had a name that officers did not say aloud in front of the troops. Haltebefehl, the hold order. In practice, it meant something even harsher. It meant retreat was not merely discouraged, it was forbidden. At 1852, Paulus looked up at the wall map of the front. Red grease pencil marks, Soviet spearheads, had been updated twice that afternoon. The line that represented the German rear area was no longer a line, it was a broken loop. His army, an entire field force of infantry divisions, motorized units, artillery regiments, engineer battalions, and thousands of vehicles, was being sealed into a pocket. Paulus's staff knew the numbers. They had been repeating them for days, like a prayer that did not work. A German infantry division in sustained combat needed hundreds of tons of supplies a day. An army trapped in winter needed more. Fuel for trucks, lubricants that didn't freeze, ammunition for artillery, rations, medical stores, replacement radio batteries, spare parts for half-tracks and tracked prime movers. The Sixth Army, even stripped to the essentials, would require several hundred tons daily to survive and fight. Now there was only one route in left, the air. At 1911, the signals officer reported that the Luftwaffe transport capacity was being organized. The words sounded confident, but they did not carry weight. Everyone in the bunker understood the reality. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet, U-52 tri-motor aircraft, Heinkel HE-111 bombers pressed into cargo duty, and whatever else could be scraped together, could not meet the tonnage requirement in clear days, let alone in snow, fog, and under Soviet fighter attack. Paulus did not argue that point out loud, not yet. He was still reading the message in his mind, trying to find the space between the words. There was none. At 1920, a liaison officer from the neighboring Romanian sector arrived with frost on his eyebrows and mud frozen on his boots. He spoke quickly, as if speed could undo the day's events. The Romanian lines had been punched through. Soviet tank corps had moved faster than anyone thought possible over the steppe. Anti-tank guns, 37mm and 47mm pieces in Romanian service, had been overrun or simply bypassed. German PaK-38 50mm guns could kill a T-34 at the right angle and range, but they were too few, and many were positioned facing east, not north and south, where the encirclement was forming. Paulus listened without interrupting. He did not need the details to understand the outcome. He needed to decide what could still be saved. On the table lay a list of fuel stocks inside the forming pocket. The numbers were too small. The Army's mobile elements, pockets of Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, assault guns, half-tracks, could still move, but not far. The distance to the nearest friendly formations outside the encirclement was measured in dozens of kilometers, and those kilometers were now filled with Soviet armor, anti-tank ambushes, and road junctions under enemy control. At 1934, Paulus stood, walked to the map, and traced a finger from the city of Stalingrad westward toward the Don crossings. His finger stopped at Kalach, the critical bridge area. Reports indicated Soviet forces had taken it. That meant the ring was not theoretical, it was physical. At 1951, a second message came in. This one was more explicit. It referenced the Führer directly and warned against unauthorized operational movements. It carried the implication that anyone who broke out on his own initiative would be held personally responsible. Paulus's chief of staff, General Arthur Schmidt, leaned in. Schmidt was not a man of dramatic speeches. He spoke in clipped staff phrases, the language of timetables and marching orders. The Führer expects the Sixth Army to hold its ground, a fortress, a hedgehog defense. Relief will come from the outside. Relief. The word sounded clean. It suggested a planned operation, a corridor, a handshake between forces. Paulus stared at the map again. Outside relief meant a counteroffensive by units that were already strained, in winter, over long distances. It meant pushing through Soviet formations that had just demonstrated they could destroy an entire front sector in days. At 20:05, Paulus requested a direct line to Army Group. The signal operators worked the switchboards and radio relays. The bunker filled with the soft clatter of a teleprinter and the murmured code words of cipher clerks. A technician adjusted the dials on a radio set, the faceplate lit dimly. When the line came through, Paulus spoke calmly, but with the edge of a man pushing against a closed door. He asked about authorization to pull the army back to a shorter line. He asked about the possibility of a breakout while fuel still existed. He did not use the word retreat. He used the language that German officers used when they wanted something politically impossible: operational freedom of movement. The answer, relayed through layers of command, was essentially the same as the message on paper: hold. At 2033, Schmidt began drafting the orders that would turn the Führer's instruction into reality at division and regiment level. The language was formal and direct. It spoke of establishing all-round defense, securing road junctions, fortifying villages, and maintaining discipline under encirclement conditions. The staff work was efficient. It always was. That was the German system: staff planning, logistics calculation, precise marching schedules, fire plans, and detailed unit boundaries. But staff efficiency could not change the strategic truth. An army that could not retreat and could not be supplied would be squeezed until it broke. At 21:10, Paulus walked out of the bunker into the cold. He stood under a black sky with no moon. Somewhere to the east, Stalingrad burned. Somewhere to the west, Soviet tank engines were already moving into positions that would cut his army off from any ground route. He listened. The soundscape was layered: distant artillery, occasional bursts of automatic fire, the hollow rumble of trucks, the metallic slap of a half-track's track links as it turned. This was not the first time Hitler had interfered in battlefield decisions. German officers had seen it before. Orders that demanded ground be held for political reasons. Orders that ignored terrain, fuel, and casualty rates. But this time, the scale was larger. This time, it was an entire army, in an open steppe, in winter, with the enemy moving faster than the German command had predicted.
and the irony was brutal. German doctrine before the war emphasized operational flexibility, maneuver, initiative, controlled withdrawals to preserve combat power. The officer corps had been trained to think in terms of maneuver. Now, maneuver was being replaced by obedience. Inside the pocket, the consequences would not arrive all at once. They would arrive by the hour. Rations shrinking, fuel freezing in drums, ammunition stocks falling, wounded piling up, radios losing batteries, trucks being cannibalized for parts, horses dying and being butchered, artillery firing fewer rounds because the shells could not be replaced. At 21:37, a staff officer hurried out with another report. Soviet troops had been sighted moving along a key road west of the headquarters.
23rd November, 1942, 06:15. Dawn front, northwest of Stalingrad. The morning came gray and hard. Ice filmed over puddles and vehicle hoods. In the shallow valleys, mist lay low like smoke. On the steppe roads, German columns moved in short bursts, engines straining, then braking, then idling again, because the routes were no longer safe. At 06:42, a reconnaissance report reached 6th Army staff. Soviet armor had reached key junctions west of Kalach. At 07:10, another report. Soviet infantry supported by tanks were establishing blocking positions along the main breakout corridors. These weren't random patrols, they were deliberate closures. Anti-tank guns placed to cover road cuts, machine guns sighted for enfilade fire, mortars pre-registered on bridges and culverts. By 08:05, the encirclement was complete in practical terms, even if the map still showed gaps. Vehicles trying to push through those gaps were being stopped by direct fire. Inside the pocket, the German chain of command began to transform from an offensive machine into a trapped system. The units in the city fought house to house. Units outside the city tried to form a perimeter. Divisions that were supposed to be maneuver elements became static strongpoints, tied to villages and river lines. The staff language changed with it. Fewer words about advances, more words about holding, securing, blocking, and maintaining cohesion. At 0917, Paulus convened his senior commanders. The meeting was not dramatic, it was clinical. In the room, officers stood with their hands behind their backs. Maps were rolled out on tables. Cigarette smoke hung near the ceiling. The question they needed answered was simple. Could they still break out? The answer was also simple. Not without permission from above. Paulus's staff officers presented the fuel figures. Every hour mattered. Tanks burned fuel even at idle, especially in winter when engines were kept running to prevent freezing. Trucks needed fuel to move wounded and ammunition. Prime movers needed fuel to pull artillery. The pocket held a mix of vehicles, some with gasoline engines, some diesel, complicating distribution. Reserves existed on paper, but much of it was scattered, frozen, or already consumed in the last frantic movements. At 0103, General Schmidt reiterated the Führer's expectation. The 6th Army would become a fortress. Relief would come from outside. The Luftwaffe would supply the pocket. The Luftwaffe, at that moment, was already committed to an air bridge that physics and numbers did not support. A U-52 could carry roughly 2 to 3 tons under ideal conditions, less in winter with icing risk and short field operations. A converted H-111 bomber could carry less. Every flight required fuel, maintenance, trained crews, and functioning airfields inside the pocket. Every landing risked being destroyed on the ground by Soviet artillery. By 11:38, the first major transport efforts began to show their limitations. Aircraft arrived with mixed loads, some ammunition, some fuel, some rations. But loads were often wrong for the immediate needs. A division might receive rifle ammunition when it needed anti-tank rounds. A hospital might receive bread when it needed bandages and sulfa drugs. The supply system was being forced to work backward, what the Luftwaffe could deliver rather than what the army required. At 12:20, Paulus issued a directive to prioritize airfields. Inside the pocket, airstrips like Pitomnik and Gumrock became lifelines. Units were tasked to defend them at all costs. Engineers worked to keep runways usable, scraping snow, filling shell holes, marking approaches with lanterns and fog. This is where the stand fast concept became more than a slogan. It became a series of written orders that traveled to the lowest levels. At 13:05, one such order went to an infantry regiment holding a sector northwest of the city. It instructed the regiment to hold its villages to the last man and forbade withdrawal without explicit authorization. The language was consistent: no independent movement, no fallback lines, no elastic defense. For decades after the war, historians would describe these as Hitler's stand-fast orders, but on the ground, they were experienced as a tactical trap. A regiment that held too long would be enveloped. A battalion that tried to pull back would risk punishment from its own command structure. Commanders at lower levels began to understand that disobedience could be fatal in two ways: by Soviet fire or by German discipline. At 1440, a German patrol near a road junction east of the Don tried to re-establish contact with a neighboring unit and found nothing. Only abandoned foxholes and the remains of a truck column. Empty ammunition boxes, a broken radio set, a torn map case, and paper. Orders, reports, unit rosters, left behind because no one had time to burn them. These were the kinds of documents Soviet intelligence teams were trained to seize. Soviet reconnaissance units didn't just take weapons, they took headquarters files, signal logs, and written orders. They knew the value of a stamped directive with a signature. A captured rifle told you one soldier existed. A captured order told you an army's intentions and its restrictions. By 0512, on the northern arc of the pocket, Soviet infantry pushed into a German outpost line after a short artillery preparation. The German defenders fell back in small groups, not as a planned withdrawal, but as a collapse. Some carried machine guns, some carried wounded, some carried nothing but their rifles and a blanket. A junior German officer, Lieutenant, early 20s, later described the moment in plain terms. He had an order that said hold, but he had no ammunition and no radio contact. He chose movement. Men survived because they moved. Others died because they stayed. But those choices were individual. Higher up, the paper order remained absolute. 24 November 1942, 0738. Soviet headquarters, Don Front Sector. On the Soviet side, staff officers began to compile material. Orders from German corps and divisions were translated, summarized, and routed to commanders. Some were used for immediate tactical decisions, predicting where Germans would hold, where they might counterattack, which airfields they would defend. Others were used for something else: proof. Proof that German commanders had been instructed not to retreat. Proof that the encirclement was not merely a battlefield accident, but something amplified by political interference from the top. At 0955, Soviet artillery increased pressure on German perimeter sectors while mobile units pushed deeper behind the line. The intent was not always to seize ground immediately. It was to force the pocket to consume ammunition and fuel, resources it could not replace. Inside the pocket, the German perimeter was stretched. The Sixth Army's divisions were no longer full strength. Many had been fighting for months. Casualty rates had hollowed out companies. An infantry company that should have held 120 to 150 men might now have 40. Machine gun teams were short of barrels. Mortar crews were short of rounds. Anti-tank guns had limited ammunition and were increasingly forced to fire at close range. At 11:06, Paulus requested again, through Army Group, a clear permission to attempt a breakout. The response was delayed, lines were jammed, messages were relayed, but the direction did not change. Hold. Relief will come. Relief in late November was a concept that quickly became an operation name, Winter Storm, the attempt by Field Marshal Erich Manstein to break through from the south with the 4th Panzer Army. Inside the pocket, word of the coming relief spread fast. It mattered psychologically. Units clung to the promise. Officers repeated it in briefings. The idea of a corridor, just one road, open for one day, became the center of hope. But hope did not change fuel consumption. At 13:30, 6th Army staff prepared contingency plans for a breakout that they were not allowed to execute. These plans were written like a man packing a bag for a journey he has been told he cannot take. They calculated march distances, road capacities, and the order of movement. Combat units first, wounded next, heavy weapons last, vehicles prioritized for fuel. They calculated the cost. Artillery that would have to be abandoned, wounded who could not be moved, rear area units that would be left behind. And they calculated the narrowest margin of all, time. By 1620, Soviet pressure increased around Pitomnik. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting ground fire on approaches. Every aircraft that 12th December 1942, 0550. Kotelnikovo, 160 kilometers southwest of Stalingrad. Before dawn, the temperature sat well below freezing. Engines coughed and caught. Exhaust hung in the air. In the staging areas around Kotelnikovo, the spearhead of Manstein's relief effort, units of 4th Panzer Army prepared to move north toward the pocket. The plan had a name, Operation Winter Storm. Its logic was straightforward. Drive fast, break the Soviet outer ring, open a corridor, and link up with the 6th Army. The corridor did not need to remain open for weeks. It only needed to exist long enough for the trapped army to break out. But the plan depended on two actions occurring at the same time. Manstein would push in, Paulus would push out. And Paulus still did not have permission to do the second part. At 0640, German armored columns rolled forward. Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks moved in line abreast with infantry and half-tracks behind them. Self-propelled guns, assault guns, and tank destroyers followed. Supply trucks trailed the combat elements, loaded with fuel, ammunition, and rations. Their path north ran across open steppe and river lines that turned into choke points in winter. Bridges became targets, roads became kill zones. Soviet anti-tank guns could be dug in, their silhouettes almost invisible against the snow and frozen ground. At 0925, the first major contacts began. Soviet units did not collapse the way they had in 1941. They fought in depth. They traded space for time. They withdrew to prepared positions and counterattacked where German armor overextended. By the evening of 12th December, Winter Storm had momentum, but it was not a breakthrough. It was a difficult advance measured in kilometers, not in the rapid operational leaps Germany needed. Inside the pocket, the 6th Army watched the relief attempt like men watching a fire approach through a blizzard, hoping it would reach them before the cold did. 13 December 1942, 0710 hours. 6th Army Headquarters, Stalingrad Pocket. Paulus received updates through intermittent signals. The reports were hopeful but vague. Manstein's forces were advancing. Some Soviet units were being pushed back. The closest point of the relief force, if it continued, might come within 50 to 60 kilometers of the pocket's southern edge. At 0803, Paulus's staff began reworking breakout calculations again. Fuel figures were even worse than in November. The pocket had been consuming reserves for weeks. Vehicles had been cannibalized. Tanks were kept under cover to reduce exposure to air attack. Artillery horses, still used heavily in German logistics, were dying in the cold or being slaughtered for meat. Rations had been reduced. Men were losing weight. Frostbite cases increased. Medical supplies ran thin. Wound infection rates climbed. At 9/12, Paulus requested authorization for Operation Thunderclap in all but name, a breakout toward Manstein's spearhead. The reply did not arrive quickly. The chain from Paulus to the Führer's headquarters ran through multiple command levels, each shaped by fear of responsibility and political consequences. At 10:44, the response came. It did not grant freedom of movement. It reinforced the stand-fast requirement and emphasized that the Sixth Army was to hold Stalingrad as a fortress. The order did not mention fuel. It did not mention the airlift's failure to meet tonnage requirements. It did not mention casualty rates. It mentioned will. In the pocket, will did not refill fuel drums. At 12:30, Schmidt drafted another directive to corps commanders. It repeated the same constraints, now with added detail. Airfields must be defended. The perimeter must not contract without explicit approval. Any withdrawal would be interpreted as weakness and invite collapse. This was the key mechanism of political interference, a doctrine imposed by paper that punished adaptation. By mid-December, the Sixth Army's perimeter was not a ring of trenches. It was a chain of brittle positions, linked by exhausted messengers and failing radios. 15 December 1942, 14:55 hours. Soviet outer ring near the Miskova River. Winter storm reached its decisive stage near the Miskova River. Manstein's armored units fought to cross and expand the bridgehead. Soviet forces responded with massed artillery and counterattacks. At 15:20 hours, Soviet armor struck Manstein's leading elements. The Germans killed tanks, but the Soviets replaced them. The Soviet system could absorb losses and still maintain pressure. The Germans could not. Every knocked-out panzer reduced the relief forces' momentum. Every destroyed truck reduced fuel delivery. Every delayed day tightened the pocket's inner crisis. At 8:40 hours, Manstein's staff recognized the strategic problem. Even if he reached the pocket's edge, Paulus would have to move immediately. The longer the delay, the weaker the Sixth Army became. Less fuel, less cohesion, fewer able-bodied men. Manstein sent messages that implied urgency. Paulus received them. Paulus could not act. The Führer's orders remained absolute. Stalingrad must be held. Retreat was forbidden. 19 December 1942, 06:35 hours. Sixth Army Headquarters. Paulus sat over the map again, now marked with tighter defensive lines. His staff had begun drawing new perimeters closer to key airfields and supply nodes. Every contraction meant abandoning wounded and stores. Every contraction also reduced the length of front the army had to hold, which was necessary for survival. But contraction itself was politically dangerous. It looked like retreat. At 7:50 hours, Paulus faced a grim arithmetic. If he attempted a breakout without authorization, he might save a portion of his army, those who could march, those who could ride, those who could still fight, but he would abandon tens of thousands, wounded, support troops, men without transport. He would also be acting against an explicit order from Hitler. If he stayed, he preserved discipline and obeyed the chain of command, but the pocket would slowly turn into a sealed container of starvation and attrition. At 9:30 hours, Paulus sent another message up the chain, asking again for freedom of movement. He framed it in operational terms.
He did not write, "We will be destroyed." He wrote, "Combat effectiveness will deteriorate." The answer came back in the same form as before. Hold. 24 December 1942, 13:10 hours. Stalingrad pocket perimeter. Christmas Eve in the pocket was not marked by ceremonies. It was marked by reduced rations and increased shelling. Soviet artillery fired into known German positions with steady rhythm. The Germans could hear the incoming shells, sometimes counting seconds between the firing and the impact. At 14:05 hours, a German field kitchen issued what it could: thin soup, bread if available, a small portion of meat if a horse had been slaughtered. Men ate quickly, then went back to their positions. At 16:30 hours, a company commander wrote a short report: ammunition low, casualties mounting, frostbite cases increasing. He attached a copy of the latest hold directive to show he was acting under orders. He sent it up the chain by runner because the radio battery was dead. This is how the paper trail grew. Every officer who knew his unit was being crushed wanted the record to show he had not abandoned his post. He had obeyed. He had been ordered to stay. Those reports, those directives, those signed sheets of paper, many would later be captured. When German positions were overrun, Soviet troops and intelligence officers searched pockets of resistance and abandoned headquarters. They found maps, orders, rosters, and diaries. They found evidence of the command climate inside the pocket. A recurring phrase appeared across these documents: no retreat. 8th January 1943, 900 hours. Soviet command post near Stalingrad. Soviet representatives delivered an ultimatum to the Sixth Army. It was not propaganda. It was a calculated move. The Soviets understood the pocket's state. They knew the airlift was failing. They knew German units were starving. Paulus rejected the ultimatum. He did so because surrender was not authorized. His army was still under orders to hold. At 10:22 hours, German staff drafted a response emphasizing continued resistance. The paper was typed, copied, and distributed. More paper, more evidence. 10th January
3rd February 1943, 08:20. Soviet collection point, Stalingrad. The battle was over, but the work continued. Soviet soldiers moved through the ruins and the frozen steppe collecting what remained: wounded, weapons, and documents. Captured headquarters sites were treated like caches. Map cases were opened. Safes were forced. Field desks were overturned. Paper scattered in snow was gathered and stuffed into sacks. At 09:05, a Soviet intelligence team cataloged a stack of German orders taken from a corps command post. The pages carried stamps, signatures, and distribution lists. Some were ordinary: ration allocations, ammunition requests, march tables. Others were different: directives emphasizing that positions were to be held without exception, withdrawals forbidden unless approved at the highest level. Those sheets mattered because they showed the internal logic of the pocket. They showed the mechanism that turned a military crisis into a mass encirclement, political control overriding operational flexibility. And Stalingrad was not the end of that mechanism. It was the demonstration. 10th March 1943, 06:30. Army Group South Sector, Eastern Ukraine. The German forces stabilized and counterattacked after Stalingrad. The front did not collapse all at once. The Wehrmacht still had skill, still had experienced officers, still had armored formations capable of rapid movement, but the command climate had shifted. At 07:15, a staff briefing at a German Corps headquarters reviewed new defensive guidance. The words were familiar now: The emphasis was on holding ground, maintaining steadfastness, and preventing panic withdrawals. It read like a lesson extracted from Stalingrad, but interpreted in the opposite direction. In German doctrine, controlled withdrawal was a tool. It preserved forces. It traded space for time. Hitler's view treated space as political territory, not tactical terrain. Every kilometer ceded was a humiliation. Every retreat hinted that Germany could lose. That belief produced orders that looked decisive on paper and destructive in practice. 5th July, 1943, 03:59, Kursk salient, near Belgorod. Operation Citadel began before dawn. German artillery opened fire. Engineers moved forward under cover of darkness, clearing minefields. Assault guns and tanks advanced behind them. Even here, during an offensive, there were signs of the shift. Commanders were pressured to hold exposed positions rather than disengage. When attacks stalled, units often remained pinned to ground they could not exploit, absorbing Soviet fire. At 0940, a German infantry battalion near a minefield reported heavy losses and requested permission to pull back to a more defensible line. The reply from higher headquarters was not a tactical adjustment. It was a reminder: hold your ground. Kursk did not end as Stalingrad ended. It ended as a failed offensive, followed by a retreat. But the retreat was increasingly managed under the shadow of Führer directives. Commanders were given less room to improvise, less room to trade ground for survival. 1st November 1943, 11:20, Dnieper Line, West Bank positions. As Soviet forces pressed westward, German units faced repeated crises: river crossings, collapsing allies, overextended supply lines. Every crisis was a moment when elasticity mattered. At 12:05, a German division commander drafted an order authorizing a limited fallback to avoid encirclement. He had the tactical logic. He had reconnaissance reports showing Soviet armor massing on his flank. He knew the risk. Then he hesitated, because the risk was no longer only enemy action, it was the political risk of being accused of disobedience. This is the deeper effect of stand-fast policy. It doesn't merely forbid retreat, it changes the psychology of command. It teaches officers that initiative is dangerous. 23rd June 1944, 0400, Belarus, Eastern Front. Soviet Operation Bagration opened with artillery concentrations that dwarfed earlier barrages. Entire German sectors were hammered, then hit by armored thrusts designed to bypass strongpoints and cut rear roads. It was encirclement warfare on a massive scale. At 0630, German commanders in Army Group Center began requesting permission to withdraw to avoid being cut off. They could see the pattern forming: Soviet spearheads pushing for junctions, bridges, and rail nodes. At 0815, higher headquarters issued instructions emphasizing holding positions. Some units did pull back, others stayed, some moved too late. The result was again what it had been at Stalingrad: pockets, encircled corps, destroyed divisions, thousands of prisoners, massive loss of equipment. The political interference did not create Soviet operational skill. The Red Army had become effective through experience, reorganization, and sheer production. But rigid German directives made Soviet breakthroughs more lethal. They reduced the options German commanders had at the precise moment when options mattered most. A single thread runs through these moments: paper orders that denied movement. And those orders did not disappear when the war ended. Many were captured, translated, archived, and later studied. They became part of the historical record that explained why certain German disasters were not just defeats, but annihilations. To show that thread clearly, the narrative returns to the human scale. One officer, one decision path, and what it meant after the guns went